48er called Albert Wolff, and he was from St. Paul. But today we have people with a different perspective, and we're going to, if you have your program, start with Niels Eichhorn. And Niels Eichhorn is going to present about I'll let him give the title. And I think what our best situation is to give this just very brief introduction, and then each time I'll say the name of the next person. So why don't we have Peter and we get going because we're late in starting, okay?
That's fine, we all know who's coming, right? Okay, thank you, Dr. Ripley. And my talk is entitled Separatist 48ers, United States, and a Legacy of 1848. In the last couple of years, there has been a blossoming of transnational scholarship in U.S. history, and a lot of historians tend to focus on the Civil War era when they talk about transnational narrative. We all know that 1848 terms have been a very important aspect of the ethnic, but also the transnational narrative. However, what I see when I look at 48er narratives is that oftentimes an overly simplistic and US-centric narrative. For example, works on 48ers usually start when the individuals arrive in the United States and not consider then the longer background, the experiences these 48ers had in Europe. Also, we often talk about 48ers as the fighters for liberty, democracy, and national unity. Well, not all 48ers were fighting for democracy. Some of them fought for republicanism. Some of them were socialists or communists. Or, not everybody stood for national unity. There were a good number of 48ers who stood for separatism, i.e. secession. In this essay then, I want to present the interplay of nationalism and separatism. And I want to look at two things. On one hand, the language being used in these agitations. And as examples, I'm going to look at Ireland, Hungary, and Schleswig-Holstein in 1848, and Poland in 1830. It's kind of a borderline case in this larger group. Second, then, I want to look at separatists coming from Europe to the United States, but they do not automatically become part then of a union-supporting organization. Some of them go south and support the Confederate States. So, by introducing a number of 30ers and 48ers then, this essay shows that grouping and defining European revolutionary migrants as liberal nationalists who supported liberty, democracy, and national unity is problematic. The language, perceptions, and experiences of European revolutionaries informed their decisions with which side to support in the coming conflict in the United States. Now, separatism is a relatively new phenomenon in the 19th century, coming about with the French Revolution starting the ideals of the nation-state, nationalism, liberty, etc. Most rebellions before 1815, I would argue, are sometimes separatist-looking, but they are more colonial revolts rather than separatist revolts, simply because you haven't developed yet a national identity yet in these. Even though then also you can say that there are some 19th century uprisings, revolts, which are more colonial revolts rather than separatist revolts. For example, the Indian Mutiny would fit into this example. The first wave of separatist uprisings, then, I would argue, occurs in 1830, when you have, for example, the Greek uprising, which by 1830 is entering its final stages and gains its independence with British and French and Russian support. 1830 also sees the uprising in Belgium, which successfully wins its independence from the Netherlands. You have Texas and Yucatan, which gain their independence during this time from Mexico, in some cases short-lived independence. And of course, in my opinion, very importantly, Poland, fighting against Russian oppression and winning its independence not winning its independence because of lack of international support and domestic disunity. From the separatist uprising of 1830, I think a couple of universal lessons can be drawn. Separatist uprisings could only succeed if the separatist movement was unified domestically against the perceived oppressor. The movement needed foreign support. All the uprisings also shared a similar language: to oppose an oppressive government that rules them, and sometimes it is being questioned, this rule, because of religious or taxation issues or constitutional issues, depending on the case. Oftentimes these uprisings start demanding constitutional reforms rather than independence. But as uprisings radicalize and escalate, very often these then translate into independence movements. Among the 1830 revolutionaries, one person I want to already point out as an individual that will reappear throughout the paper, Adam Górowski, a Polish radical who left Poland after the uprising in 1830, went to Paris, and he is an interesting figure because he actually will publish a book gaining an amnesty from the Tsar, and as a result goes into the service of the Tsar, even though he was charged with treason and was supposed to be executed. And he eventually will also again annoy the Tsar, have to leave Russia, works a couple of years in Switzerland, and by November of 1849 he comes to the United States. So he is more of a Serdia, but he is kind of a group of 1848ers that comes to the United States. 1848, probably the most famous and most important of the separatist uprisings of that year would be Hungary, a huge province within the Habsburg Empire that desires constitutional reforms, its own budget, and control over its legal systems. It again rises up in 1848 as all the countries within Europe have revolutions. Initially, the Austro-Croatian armies of the Habsburg Empire are unable to defeat the uprising, but as disunity within Hungary then escalates into an independence rather than an autonomy movement, you see the Hungarian cause disintegrate and the Austrian armies being able to defeat the Hungarians. Oftentimes we talk about the Russians being the main groups that brings about the defeat, but scholarship actually indicates that Austria probably would have been able to do it on their own. Probably longer, but it would have been possible. The uprising in Hungary ends in August of 49. Now the longest uprising of all the 1848 uprisings is what we have heard already a few times here, Schleswig-Holstein. Again, rising up against the perceived constitutional infringements of the Danish king against outside rule. German states support the Schleswig-Holstein rebels against the Danish kingdom, and you have also a very strong international aspect in this uprising. First Schleswig-Holstein War ends in early 1851 with defeat, as so often with separatist uprisings. While Schleswig-Holstein is the longest of the 1848 uprisings, the shortest uprising of separatist nature is Ireland, lasting about 2 weeks. The Irish had broken apart over reforms. The O'Connellites had been arguing for constitutional reforms without violence. Young Irish radicals, however, had called for, if necessary, violence to bring about the repeal of the Act of Union of 1800. When the potato famine strikes, Britain suspends the writ of habeas corpus, implements the Treason Felony Act. You see an uprising starting in Ireland, which is unplanned and fails fairly soon after its start. It is then the Irish who are the first to leave the European continent. Here, I just want to briefly point out a couple of individuals who we'll see again during the rest of the paper. For example, most important, I would say, is John Mitchell and Thomas Meagher. Both of them are convicted under the Treason Felony Act, initially to death, but are charged then, changed to transportation, and they have to spend a couple of years in Van Diemen's Land. Both Meagher and Mitchell will escape from Van Diemen's Land in the early 1850s and come to New York to welcome and rival Klaus Kossuth's welcome in New York City. Huge crowds coming to the country. On the Hungarian side, interesting figure, I think, would be Alexander Sambor Aspas, who is a close confidant of Klaus Kossuth and who comes with the USS Mississippi in November of 1851 to the United States. Schleswig-Holstein, we already have heard the individuals here that I think are of influence and interest. Theodor Olshausen and Hans Reimer Klaus, who are arriving in the United States and going to Missouri. Now when the 48ers arrive, and 30th, in the United States, they find a country torn by sectional conflict. They find a country that is facing political crisis over the debates of political party realignment. Of course, the Republican Party will heavily rely in the Western states on this immigrant vote, and Olshausen and Clausen will play influential roles within Iowa in regard to the formation of the Republican Party. However, on the Irish side, the Irish will continue to vote predominantly for the Democratic Party, fearing the nativist aspects of the Republican Party. Now, we all know that slavery plays an important role within this. However, I would argue that slavery plays a different role when we might be expected. And I'm saying that because when I look at the language used in Europe, many times you see the description of the perception of oppression being done with terms that relate to slavery, that we need to emancipate ourselves, that we are suffering under a slavery-type government in Europe. And when revolutionaries use that type of language, they're much more likely to side with the United States in the Union. Versus if you construe your language as in constitutional terms, like, for example, a lot of Irish individuals do, it's much more likely that these individuals then side with the Confederacy. Now, examples would be, for example, Borowski is highly anti-slave, and many Poles consider the conflict that they fought in Europe as part of an emancipation from Russian rule. So when Borowski comes over, he is witnessing the Compromise of 1850. During the discussions, he is in Boston, and he has this beautiful statement. Quote, "I can read the Constitution as well as Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster should be hung for advocating it. He is a humbug or an ass, and as if he believes such an infamous law to be constitutional. And if he doesn't believe it, he is a humbug and a scoundrel for advocating it." Now, I'll spare you the new debates that Borowski also had during this time. So Borowski is very focused on the emancipation, slavery kind of language. In contrast to that, we have John Mitchell, who transitions through Nicaragua to New York on his way from Van Diemen's Land. During that transition, he has an interesting conversation with an American. And this relates to filibuster activities, for example, which just a few years earlier you had with the Lopez filibuster in Cuba. He asks, "After all," I ask, "have the Americans a right to Cuba?" "No," the American says, "but the Cubans have a right to Cuba, even as the Irish have a right to Ireland. And Spain holds it against the right owners with a monstrous garrison, as England holds Ireland against you. Would a filibuster expedition of Americans to Ireland to aid you and your friends in driving out the British appear to you an act of piracy and robbery?" So we're talking about a very similarity of experience here. Now, Mitchell is interesting in another respect. Mitchell is a proponent of slavery. Mitchell is one individual who will argue for the reopening of the transatlantic slave trade when he is in Oxford. And again, let me quote from him. He would be a bad Irishman who voted for principles which jeopardize the present freedom of a nation of white men. For the vague hope of elevating blacks to a level which it is at least problematic whether God and nature intended so. Now Mitchell did not have, when he wrote this line, contact with Americans, with U.S. slavery. It's likely that some of this opinion is influenced from his about a month-long stopover on the Brazilian coast when he was transitioning to Van Diemen's Land. On the 48er side, on the Schleswig-Holsteiners, it's very obvious that they are standing completely against slavery and are not in any kind of way interested in supporting the institution. They actually argue for the coming of civil war to end the institution. Gorosky would use fairly similar arguments in his works regarding slavery. Now, when we get to the American Civil War, the question really becomes, where do we go? Who do we side with? What government is most of interest? Now, the Germans in Missouri are of interest, obviously, because the Germans of Missouri stand with the Union and are, in part, protecting the government against the Confederacy. And Union Commander John C. Fremont has on his staff Alexander Aspis. And the bodyguard of Fremont is commanded by Charles Zaguni. The Hungarians fight as well as the Germans on the Union side in the war. John Mitchell, on the other hand, he is too old to fight. Two of his sons will be fighting within the Confederacy, but Mitchell will be siding with the Confederacy and work as a newspaper writer. He will initially join the Richmond Enquirer, but because of his disagreements with the Jefferson Davis government, he eventually joins the Richmond Examiner and takes on an opposition to the government of Davis, which is very similar to what, for example, happens among the Polish and German migrants of the separatist community. Olshausen, when the election of 1864 arrives, calls Lincoln's government, quote, a pitiful administration, the country overrun by corruption and fraud, and a miserable war effort, end quote. Gorosky writes in his diaries, quote, re-election, re-election, it is sickening to mind and body. Why has not Congress the plug to assert its power? Crush the politicians, take Lincoln, Seward, and Blair by the collar, shake the shenanigans, shame souls from them, and throw them in the deepest dungeon of Fort Lafayette, all the tribe of weeds. So there's a certain opposition among the separatists of 1848, which is very similar to what they did in Europe. They stood for civil liberties and saw that the Lincoln government was infringing on civil liberties. As a result, much like in Europe in 1848, they fight against these infringements. Now, Olshausen is one of the main proponents then of the Fremont candidacy, and he will be pushing for Fremont at the Cleveland Convention. The newspapers will call the activities of Olshausen and others into questioning the future of the Union. One newspaper in Missouri, for example, describes the Olshausen activities and group as the Olshausen clique in somewhat derogatory terms. Now, it's interesting, of course, to note that when the election then of 1864 occurs, and with the victories of Phil Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman, Lincoln's election becomes guaranteed. Lincoln is elected. And in January of '65, for example, Olshausen decides that he's no longer comfortable in the United States and decides to leave. Like many other radicals, Olshausen loved the concept of democracy, I would argue. But when democracy did not work in his favor, he ran or fought the results. A very common activity among 48ers and exiles in Europe and in the Americas. Another interesting example would be Gaspar Taufman. Taufman is a Polish surgeon. He, in 1861, goes to the Montgomery government and suggests the recruitment of a Polish division, of a Polish brigade. He is able to get this done. In December of 1863, the Polish Democratic Society in Europe questioned Taufman for having grossly violated Polish principles. Taufman claims that as a citizen of Virginia, he had not violated any laws. He thus embraced the state rights and state identity so dear to many Southerners. He especially rejected any notion that he had violated the principles of the Polish national cause. Of course, we could end the story here and say, well, 48ers, separatists of 48 have changed and have adopted to their home countries, that they are no longer separatists. But when you look then at Europe, a different picture starts to emerge again. They still are separatists, just in their national terms. 1863, Poland rises up again, and there are cases being made that some of the individuals in the United States of Polish origin say they would like to go back and continue the struggle against the Russians as they are being fought against. Schleswig-Holstein, 1864, again tries to implement the Augustenberg family and gain its independence from the Danes, but becomes Bismarck's play ball in the larger scheme of German unification. Both of them again fail in gaining what they have demanded since 1848. Hungary, on the other hand, is different. Under the Ausgleich of 1866, Hungary gains autonomy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ireland, probably the most interesting case. The Fenian Brotherhood embraces a terror campaign against the British, trying to gain Irish independence, which again fails to come together. Separatism had failed across the Atlantic world by the 1880s. The separatist movement in the United States had failed, but the Confederate States were not the only ones. Ireland, Schleswig-Holstein, Poland, and Hungary had already established precedent that without foreign support, which the Confederacy never gained, and without domestic peace, which failed with the resistance to the Davis administration, separatist movements would not succeed. All 5 of the movements have been unsuccessful. While separatism was an outgrowth of the new liberal nationalism, separatism had a much harder time succeeding against modern nation-states. As separatists from Europe came to the United States and encountered Southern separatism, they faced a difficult task in determining which sides they would support. All of them had used the language that describes the relationship between their nation and the states they were part of in anti-imperial language and claimed violations of constitutional rights, much like Southerners had done. Many had also used the language of slavery to describe the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. If the language of slavery was part of their European struggle, European separatists were likely to support the Union. If they based their arguments on liberal nationalism, the European separatists had a tougher decision to make. Some joined the South, and others the North. Those who went north used the language of liberty and liberal nationalism to defend against an oppressive South, with slavery and constitutional limits. Those who went south fell in line with the Southern arguments of oppression. Because of this complex situation, it seems essential to understand the origins of the arguments Europeans made during their revolutionary experience, and how these related to the United States. Being a revolutionary in Europe did not mean migrants automatically supported the Union. Thank you.
So maybe breaking with the rules a moment, we could allow a question or two directly, because this is a rather interesting new concept. We think that the notion of separatism is not independent to the United States, but is kind of a Western situation with both such places as Ireland, Schleswig-Holstein, and the Russian things, and the Hungarian ones. Anybody got a specific question? Please.
No, thanks a lot for your topic. You introduced this by introducing the term transnationalism. And I was wondering if you could tease that out a little bit. If you're seeing this in a transnationalistic context, what does this tell us when we look at both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, on some level, it's kind of the language informing one another part. Okay. When you look at the literature that is being done currently, and I'm thinking here Paul Quigley or Andrew Flashy, it's like the language that Americans use, and sometimes it's the immigrants that bring it over, and sometimes it's the literature that's being read in America. It's the same language that you see in 48 that is being used in the United States in the lead up to the Civil War. Okay. And you also have, I mean, the other informing that I'm not dealing with at all in the paper and not in the scholarship that I'm currently writing the book on, is you also have the language of emancipation in the British Caribbean informing the decision. So we often think of the United States as, how do you say it, that it's developing its own language in regard of how do we engage this constitutional oppression, the secession. But when you look at it, it's part of a much broader language. And that's kind of what I want to get to, that we need to think of the American Civil War no longer as this exceptional domestic event, but there's a lot of bigger stories there where it fits into a much larger picture, where the South is not a unique experience, but it's part of a larger set of revolutions. And I think this, looking at transnational actors like the 48ers will give this a much broader, more personal experience than, oh yeah, here are you 48ers fresh off the boat, and where do we put them?
I mean, as you're talking here, Andrew Zimmerman's going in the back of my head.
Yes.
Let's take one more question and then we'll move on, and at the end we'll have the group of three answering questions again. One more, please.
Niels, I know you are the ultimate expert of this wonderful 48er Schneiden from Schleswig-Holstein, who became a buddy of Seward, and is your research about Schneiden connected to your concept, what Vern Ripley
I threw Schneiden out during the presentation because of time constraints, but I'm kind of uncomfortable of putting him into the Separatist book simply because I want to work on him eventually more again, but because he is not an immigrant, that's why I'm kind of a little uncomfortable of putting him in. I'm using stories of him because he is anti-slavery, no question about it. He tries to bring about peace. So there are a lot of connections of what he does in 48 in Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark, Germany that informs his activities with regard to the Civil War, but I have the feeling that he's not fitting with the narratives that I'm intending to look at here, that I'm trying to tell.
Niels, could you give 40 seconds biography of Schneiden so people learn what great guy that is?
Let's hold up on that until we're all done, and then I will do that.
The paper triggered to my mind the 1991 situation in the United States, because secession is such a taboo in the United States. And in the year 1991, the countries of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and so on were declaring their independence. And the earlier Bush would not recognize those countries, grounding his reasoning on the situation of the United States with secession of South Carolina, and in fact for Eichhorn's home state, currently teaching in Georgia, where this tradition, of course, is very well known to us. So I thought it was surprising back then in 1991 that such small countries as, for example, Iceland, immediately recognized the independence, and it took the United States 5 months to come to the same conclusion. But I think we need to move on, and so we'll go to Peter Mathews, who comes to us from New Jersey and is an expert on the history of the Germans in New Jersey. Has been for many years. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
The other piece.
Your geography is a little bit slow this morning.
He's a little bit from the east.
Peter is Berlin, that's Germany, and New Jersey is Frank Sinatra, or both.
No, Mathews I'm talking about.
This is not Frank Sinatra.
So, well, who is next here? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, we got the I'm all figured out having talking about these. Anyway, comes to us from Berlin, and is a resident formerly of Bremerhaven. Bremerhaven being the export, as you know, export of immigrants for 100 years, 150 years, 1856, I think they first introduced sailing ships by steam. I'm sorry, they replaced sailing ships with steamships. That took on, of course, a great new, different situation. And so let's let him tell the story. He's currently living in Berlin. He's kind of an independent writer and various other things. Okay, sorry for the mix-up.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you for inviting me to present my research. But caution, I'm not a historian. I wrote, beside others, a lot of suspense stories. And Yogi asked me on Monday, why the hell, you don't say why the hell, why do you work since years about this mad unknown poet? One answer is because I love madmen and characters, and the life will be tell you, I have to tell you, has the most fantastic plot. The best detective stories mostly begin with a disaster. It comes after trouble to a happy end. Now I will tell you such a story of life and death, and the case may have a solution and a legacy for all of us. Historians of German literature of the 19th century occasionally have doubts whether or not I'm being serious when I speak about Harro Harring. I have pride the knowledge of colleagues who studied Büchner, Heine and Börne, all being contemporaries and companions of Harro Harring, but no one could either remember him nor thought him to be any significance worthy of mention. By my research, I'm forever surprised to keep bumping into Herr Harring where others do not see him. His bibliography comprises more than 100 works, including the 1,000-page autobiographical novel Bon Hayat, dramatic works, poems, songs, Schmotzetten, as well as leaflets and many hundreds of letters to his friend Tolson, which are held in the State Library in Kiel. For decades, in the 19th century, his work was extremely popular, often to be found in the knapsacks of every craftsman, though they were quickly banned and ultimately forgotten. In the first half of the 19th century, he was present whenever there was an opportunity to practice and participate and give commentary in the turmoil of pre-March. His greatest gift, though, was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had powerful enemies, such as Fürst von Metternich and Karl Marx, who persecuted and mocked him during his lifetime. Censors avidly banned his books, and the author was imprisoned and deported. But his vision of a free Europe ultimately prevailed. Here's a brief outline of his life and work. Harro Harring was born on the 28th of August 1798 at Ebenshof near Husum and died at the age of 71 in 87 in the Isle of Jersey, where he took his own life. He put a dagger through his heart. His father, a dike warden, died when Harro was 10 years old. 5 brothers died of consumption. Death, being his childhood companion, cohabited his lifelong adventures and despairs, and was most probably the driving force in his motto, freedom and or death. His father's death and debts forced the 10-year-old, his mother and brother to leave their home on the dike. In Husum, he became an apprentice in the custom office, where he learned to read and write, and it was here he decided that if he wasn't to die, he wanted to be an artist, a war artist. He studies painting in Copenhagen and Dresden, where, on the recommendation of the painter Dahl, he was given a scholarship from the Danish Crown Prince, and where he met his idol Caspar David Friedrich. He wore the library of the Gießener Schwarzen, those revolutionary demagogues. His friend Boldemann, a member of the fraternity in Jena, sent him with conspiratorial instructions to Vienna and Prague. In Vienna, Metternich's police told him cut his hair, otherwise he would have been deported. Long hair and black dress being associated with the uniform of the revolution. In the age of Biedermeier, he was a German Don Quixote who tilted the windmills of reaction and fought in the name of freedom. At the Wartburg celebrations of 1870s, where Luther and German unity were affirmed, progressive books such as the Kurzweil were burned, and it was here that the cause of unity and freedom found its first followers amongst the students. The young enthusiasts were not only drunk with the concepts of freedom and fatherland, but were prepared to act violently in the name of the cause. In the same manner that modern terrorism seeks symbolic targets, the fraternal brother Karl Sant murdered the poet Kotzebue, believing him to be a spy and traitor of the nationalist cause. As a result, the Karlsbad decrees sharply curtailed the freedom of the press and all democratic organizations. The zeitgeist, especially amongst the students, applauded the assassin both openly and covered. Berne thought the assassination an act of stupidity. Karl Follen, the spiritual instigator, called for an armed struggle in 1820, was forced to immigrate. He landed at Boston University, where his career flourished. I quote, "We must win the people's freedom through any means at our disposal. Rebellion, tyrannicide, and all that is identified as a crime to be punished in ordinary life should be included as the means against tyranny. We should take up all arms available to us." Quote, strong words and the illusionary of initiating a revolt in the 34 small states of Germany, where at the same time Ludwig Tieck and Arthur Schopenhauer were philosophizing about God and the world in the saloons and pubs of Dresden. Schleiermacher said, I quote, "No one who requires a holy scripture to practice a religion is a true believer, but those who requires none could probably write their own." End of quote. And everyone, including Harro Harring, said at that time, "I am God." On one pursued the ideas of the religion of freedom. The fight for freedom became a divine mission and would become a spiritual movement and an important expression for political religious romanticism, and the liberation theology presents well into the late 30s. With the beginning of 1821, the Greeks, led by Alexander Ypsilanti, a Greek in the Russian service, advocated military force to liberate Greece from Turkish domination, causing a solidarity movement throughout Europe. The powers of progress believed that they could achieve in Hellas what which, due to their own weaknesses, they were not able to do in their homelands. To overthrow the ruling powers. One had a vision of Hellas to antiquity being returned to the rule of the people. In that time, Greek societies were founded, particularly in Germany, where money is collected and volunteers came forward to support the fight for freedom. So euphoria did not only include students who were not able to advance the revolution in Germany, but also a wider circle as from the middle class, former soldiers, the aristocracy and princes, including the likes of the Bavarian king. Greek societies had nearly 19,000 members, and soon corps and volunteers were assembled and sent off to Greece. Harro Harring also called the Greek fever in his studies, went to Marseille to sail with the volunteers' corps into battle. but the campaign for the liberation of Greece, which fighters from all over Europe known as the Philhellenics celebrated and prepared with such enthusiasm, was a disaster. After an uncomfortable sailing trip, Harring and the motley troop of enthusiastic soldiers landed on a desolate beach at Navarino. The Greeks, to whom they wanted to offer help, ignored and plundered them, and the provision were appalling. Harro and co. spent 3 weeks stricken with diarrhea and fever, saw no enemy, but instead witnessed the feverish death of his friend Voldemar. The soldiers, artillery were disposed of by Greek thieves, and ultimately they just managed to save themselves by taking passage to Italy. Harro became sick with fever. Afterwards in Rome, he experienced the German and Danish artists community who rebelled in classicism. Harro was disappointed with the Greeks, but remained well disposed to them. Although the documentation is not that substantial, it seems that Harring met the British poet Lord Byron in Livorno, with whom he spoke about and described the disaster in Greece. Harring was in Livorno at the same time as Byron cremated his poet friend Shelley on beachside funeral pyre. Byron later went with a private army to the Peloponnese, where he died from typhus, and also he saw no Turkish soldier. Only in 1820 were the Allied French, English and Russian victorious at the naval battle at Navarino, and the way for a new Greece was open. In 1830, a Bavarian, Otto I, was crowned King of Greece, but the reverse of an ancient Greece was not going to be. In the following years, Harro Harring essays and reports described and analyzed the situation of Greece very accurately. Greece was a central theme in literary writings and poems. His dramatic works were performed with great success in Munich and then in Vienna. Even King Ludwig received him, and the kinship of Greece united them. He went to Vienna to work as a dramaturg, was unsuccessful, and again his Philhellenic reputation remained suspicious to Metternich and the Viennese police. He was kept under surveillance and ultimately expelled. In Prague, he tried to liberate Ypsilanti, who was still in prison in the fortress of Theresienstadt, but failed. In 1828, returning to Munich, Harring became acquainted with Heinrich Heine and wrote in the newspaper which Heine edited about the situation in Greece. Heine refused to publish Harring's name as the censors of the German League were already very aware of Harring, and Heine did not want to create problems that there was. Nevertheless, Heine found Harring's opinion so interesting that he printed Harro's contribution in his magazine. In Heine's travelogues, especially the Bars of Lucca, one finds literary references to Napoleon which Harring had written the previous year. Harring had great respect for Heine and wrote lengthy reviews about Heine's books, trying to mimic Heine's slightly ironic and amusing writing style. While reading Harring's writings, Hans Christian Andersen found great similarity with those of Harry Heine. Harro, like Harry, both about the same age, were both very wrong in the assessment of Russian reign. Heine believed the Tsars to be enlightened monarchs, and having, at the age of 30, fled to Warsaw after the completed and published Wrong Aya, his 1,000-page autobiographical novel. He wanted to crusade with the Poles against the Turks and earn a title so that he could marry his love, Ludmilla, the Bohemian Duchess. But what a mistake. The Philhellene was captured at the border and forced into the Russian army. Here for a year he led the life of a nobleman, learning and informing himself about political relationships in Poland, and at the same time gaining much trust from his superiors, some who tried to hire him as an agent provocateur. Assumably, he was gather information in the revolutionary circles of Europe, and at the same time spin intrigues into the interest of Russia. Harro declined in disgust, and its only option was to flee, not to his duchess, who has already married someone more suited to her rank, but arrived in 1930 in Dresden, then went to Leipzig, where he became a Freemason and wrote his memoirs of Poland under Russian rule. The book was the first comprehensive report about the situation in Poland, which was completely isolated from the outside world. Published conspirationally by Reklam, the book was a great success and contributed to a Polish enthusiasm in Germany and a lifelong persecution by the Russian authorities. From a Philhellenic herring, a Polish herring was born. The book was immediately banned by the Prussian administration when it took Europe by storm and was translated into many languages. He left Poland in June 1830. In November, the First Warsaw Uprising began. Polish freedom fighters staged a coup against the Russian Crown Prince Constantine, and thus began a war that lasted over a year. The Poles lost their bid for freedom, and thousands of Poles went into exile, forming from then on a kind of a revolutionary reserve army in Europe. Harro wrote many books, poems, theater plays, and appeals from the Polish cause, and the Poles became his soul brothers, remaining loyal to him until his death and even providing him with a small pension. However, with the conscription in Poland caused him to lose his Spanish passport, and he was, as he later wrote, sans nation et sans patrie, without a nation and fatherland. Werner remarked similarly about himself: he was born without fatherland. Thus, these Vaterlandslosen Gesellen, as they would later be denigrated, appeared as a historical example of the current debate of whether one has a German or European identity. During Harring's lifetime, there was a constant shift between Germanism, internationalism, Frisian patriotism, Scandinavism, and cosmopolitan views, like the ebb and flow on the coast. For Harring, there was only one homeland: freedom. And freedom for Harring was, as Chris Christopherson wrote in 1968, and Janis Joplin sang, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. In 1831, Harring went to Strasbourg, where the German refugees had gathered. Georg Büchner was studying there at the same time, and even if not no direct encounter was recorded, Büchner took part in the activities that Harring initiated. The formulation of the concepts and leading the struggle against authorities were very similar. Harring edited a newspaper entitled Das Konstitutionelle Deutschland, and he renamed it Deutschland. Already here could feel how the revolutionaries prepared themselves for a united and free Germany of the future. They practically created a governmental program that would assure Germans' rebirth. After the uprising in Warsaw and Paris, they believed Belgium's declaration of independence to be an advanced and liberal example in the next step for the revolution. They placed great hope on the Hambacher Fest celebration in May 1832. For some, it should have been the signal for the creation of a counter-government, but the collective citizens didn't trust themselves. They waited for a sign from Paris that had 2 years previously gone to the barricades. They wanted a united attack. But only in July of 1832 did a collection of Democrats, craftsmen, businessmen, and vingerers from the German lands go into the streets of Paris. In Hamburg, they could not agree to go on agenda. They didn't feel competent. Ludwig Börne and Harro Harring, the one a Jew, the other a Friesen by birth, were celebrated at the festivities with the torchlight procession. Harro's songs were sung, his flyers read, but together as a representative they were not united. Harro, seen as a Dane, was never once accepted, which infuriated him. At the time of the festivities, however, that was not important. He was already for an armed rebellion. His followers sang this verse, ein Example, so kann's nicht länger gehen, auf, lasst uns vorwärts gehen, Volk ins Gewehr, deutsches Volk, stark und kühn, musst du in den Kampf nun ziehen, soll dir dein Heil erblühen, zögere nicht mehr. I quote, we cannot tolerate it any longer, up, let us go forward, people to arms, German people strong and brave must join the fight, salvation blooms for you, wait no longer. Quote end. The festival initiators, the journalist Siebenpfeifer, swore friendship for the European people, but no binding action or organization resulted from it. Only the German League, acting under the chairmanship of Metternich, maintained that peace in the country was more important than the song of freedom. After the festival, the ringleaders were arrested and denounced, the press association were banned, and census of the press increased. Anyone who possessed any of Harro's writings was in danger of imprisonment. Even at the festival, they tried to arrest Harro and others, but through the solidarity of the people and the deployment of citizens was his arrest hindered. Now, he could only live and travel undercover, constantly changing his name. In total, he wrote years later, he was arrested, imprisoned, or expelled 23 times between 1830 and 1835. At the Hamburger Castle, where a large exhibition is dedicated to the Democratic Festival, one finds Werner's name, but if one looks for the name of Harro Harring or his pseudonym of that time, Louis Hauptstrecke, one search in vain. Harro did hit for a time in France, further preparing for an armed rebellion that was to have begun with a raid on the central police station in Frankfurt. But this campaign was betrayed by an informant and failed. The military taking off the Kiel's fortress with students from Strasbourg under Harring's leadership was not to happen. With his holy flock of nearly 500 Polish soldiers, he went to Switzerland. There he met Giuseppe Mazzini, who had just fled in Switzerland from Italy following a failed coup. Mazzini was, like Harring, a Freemason and well-versed in conspiracy. Switzerland, which has recently disposed of its own aristocracy, gave the combined forces asylum. The revolutionaries used this opportunity to plan a new rebellion to be launched with the invasion of Savoy, where they would overthrow first Karl Albrecht, but dilettantism and betrayal doomed the rebellion. Mazzini personally appointed General Ramorino to command the insurgent, but Ramorino was bribed to the French Secret Service. Instead of marching his force to Italy, they paraded on the Lake Geneva, and until Swiss National Guard could do nothing else but arrest and expel them. That was in January of 1834. Harry fled back to France and wrote in French his memories of the campaign and furious poems about Ramorino. Mazzini stayed active underground in Switzerland. In Bern on the 15th of April 1834, Mazzini, along with 5 Germans, 5 Poles and 6 Italians, founded the secret society Das Junge Europa. The society, under the motto of freedom, equality and humanity, decided to fight using any means possible for a Europe without borders and princes. They wanted equal rights, human right, and rich right of speech. It was the first international coalition that espoused the slogan, Democrats from every country unite, and so forecasting and prophesying the birth of a modern Europe. But it was, medically spoken, a premature child and not capable of surviving. In the same year, the revolutionaries were inspired by the Frenchman Padre Lemonnier, whose Words of the Believer, a revolutionary sermon on the Mount, and an alternative testament justifying the democratic movement and also declaring the cause of the people as the cause of God. The religion of freedom was given as an theological dimension. Pope Gregory XVI, who could only save the Vatican from bankruptcy with financial assistance from Austria, reacted promptly in the spirit of Metternich and encyclical. He banned all revolutionary thoughts from the church. But in the cause gained momentum. Ludwig Bernhard immediately translated the text into German, and Harring translated Lamennais' ideas into political action. In the summer of 1834, he wrote his words of a man who translated Lamennais' ideas in a political program and developed a bizarre utopia built on numbers 11 of government. The same year, Harring also wrote about religion and philosophy, the zeitgeist completely detaching itself from absolutism. Here, Büchner interpreted the unrest more radically. His Hessischer Landbote began with the legendary call, Friede den Hütten, Krieg den Palästen, peace to the huts, war on the palaces, which a sentence I quote, in the 1834 it looked like the Bible was publishing lies. Büchner was, however, first a poet. His leaflet was the very best of political literature, but was concerned that Mazzini's Europe manifest and Harring's dreams placed their faith more than the governors than the workers and farmers. Metternich and the German League reacted nervously to these developments. They responded with sharper censorship of the press and went after the revolutionaries. From 1833 in Mainz, Metternich responded to the failed attempt to take over the Frankfurt Central Police Station by establishing, I quote, the first official centralized political police news service organized on German soil, end of quote. Created especially to keep the movement of Das junge Europa in check, this service covered all of Europe with a network of spies and informers were paid to collect and analyze all confidential material. But 1835 and later in Vienna-based Central Information Committee was already following and informing on the members of over 200 Republican clubs and other suspects in 7 countries. In the State Archive of Baden-Württemberg, I found references in over 16 informants' accounts just alone to Harring. When we marvel over the monitoring and telecommunication and internet, we find here a historical example. Metternich's monitoring system was everywhere at that time, even internationally, and they collected everything. Even then there was justification for the war on terrorism. Maybe the NSA is a legacy of the response to pre-March actions. So, due to their support of the Junge Europa, Jaws of Europe, the Swiss League was under the enormous amount of pressure to cancel asylum for political refugees. The Swiss tried to defend themselves, but when Austria, Russia, French, and the German League threatened to declare Swiss passports null and void and made all Swiss travel and business in Europe impossible, that they bent to the pressure. The migrants were deported, France granted them safe conduct, and Harring left the country. London became for years a place of exile for the revolution. Harro Harring was then 30 years old, and the wanderings of the Odysseus of freedom, as the historian Walter Graf wrote, were just beginning. I would like to note the following years and catch his phrases, however, because that is, man lived through is not only too much for just one life, but also for a lecture. Harro didn't stay in London. We went to Helgoland. There, due arguments, he was expelled, went back to Switzerland, was arrested with Mazzini, expelled again, went to Bordeaux, and was given a job writing about slavery in Brazil to the British newspaper. At this point, he hardly had an income. His books were banned. He painted portraits in commission and starved. In 1840, he went to Rio de Janeiro as a translator, documented the conditions in the most unfortunate nations of West Africa, I quote, in pictures, and published his report in an English paper in tropical scenes. It was the first report about slavery in Brazil. He returned to London, painted portraits of British dignitaries, went back to South Africa in 1842, met Mazzini's comrade Giuseppe Garibaldi, and suggested that they found the United States of South America. Garibaldi first wanted to unite Italy and ordered Harring to go to New York in order to organize a ship for the Italian revolutionaries who wanted to return to support Italy. Arriving in New York, he realized that the mission had already been betrayed. Harring wrote Dolores, a novel about the situation in South America. Harring was accused of profanity and the book could not initially be printed. Representatives of the Methodist Church accused him of blasphemy because the lifestyle of the novel's main character, Dolores, encouraged living in sin. The case was brought to court, and is noteworthy because many Protestant Christians migrated to the USA to gain religious freedom. They appeared to claim religious freedom as something belonging uniquely to them, an interpretation that remains to this day. But Harring had prominent advocates like the diplomat Everett and the author Margaret Fuller, who took up his cause, helped him financially, and published the book. It had many editions. Harring was finally acknowledged. He became a US citizen and went to Philadelphia, when in 1848, having barely gotten settled, he heard that the revolution in Germany had broken out. He left everything as it was and returned with many other freedom refugees to Schleswig-Holstein. Finally, the revolution had arrived. On the 19th of July, 1848, after his long odyssey, Harring was greeted jubilantly in Tönning, Schleswig-Holstein. In Bredschied, he delivered a speech in the cabin, wearing the black uniform and the golden star on his head of the young of the Jews of Europe. He was caught between two worlds. In spite of the democratic rhetoric, the discussion was not about democracy and freedom, but rather whether or not Cimbria, as Schleswig-Holstein was called at that time, should join with the German League to stay with Denmark. Harring was represented a European idea of international community without borders, pled surprisingly for an independent state of Friesen and unified Scandinavia. He wanted to vanquish the princely dynasty and considered the question of border as a trivial matter. This was not well received, and all of his soaring plans to stay in North Friesland were shredded in this one argument. Harry went to Norway, where he served as a representative of Mazzini and became the publisher of the newspaper The Voice of the People. And in that time, he was famous for the local authorities suspicious. He was arrested yet again under protest from the young Henrik Ibsen, among others, and transported by ship to England. Once again, he wandered around, tried to work as an artist, mathematician, and shipbroker, but this time was up. In 1855, he moved to the Channel Island of Jersey, which at that time was a place of exile for his friends Victor Hugo and Konrad Schramm, and stayed there with the expectation of a few excursions until his death. Mazzini, who with Garibaldi managed to unite Italy, remained his steadfast friend even as Harring sank slowly into depression and confusion. On May 15, 1870, Harro Harring planted a dagger into his chest in his cottage at St. Helier on Jersey. Admittedly, such a life is confusing, even for the observer. It would be suitable for studies about multiple personalities using the motto, I am many. When one reads his work, one feels a great need to belong and to be recognized. In Harring, one can see what happens with talented people who are denied an entity or affiliation. They go mad. Harro Harring was an European intellect, an artist whose work was over time be disregarded. His poems and songs accompanied the struggles of the revolution until 1848 and belong to the cultural heritage. One of his best friends, Giuseppe Mazzini, once called him in a letter, I quote, agony. quote, and said he was the best man in the world and at the same time the most excruciating idiot of his time. If it is true that one learns mostly from defeat, then Harring is one of whom we can learn that an idea is necessarily bad because it is ahead of its time, and that men with faults and weaknesses can definitely foster great thoughts. Ultimately, however, Harro Harring is victorious. His mad dream of unique Europe from 1834 became a reality, and the ideas of the young Europe were ultimately more sustainable as those of the social revolutionaries and communists, people whom Harring and Mazzini had considered bourgeois. He fought over Greece, Poland, and Europe. He was one of the first to fight slavery. He is one that we can proudly name on the first modern Europeans in the world. Ultimately, however, the ideas and the values of the 48er revolution are also victorious. It is in the legacy, the unknown man, and we also often forgot good woman. In the enlightened societies in the West, freedom seems like fresh air. But freedom, humanity, and equal rights are not for free. We have to learn, live, and teach, and nevertheless we have to fight for it. It's a great legacy. It is more than the game of life and death. It's more serious. Thank you.
So before we get too pinched for time, let's allow yet one question or so. Anybody? Is there any one question or so? We got to open up the projection system anyway. If we have a question, we can take it. Otherwise, we'll just introduce the next speaker. His name is Lubrecht, and he is a specialist, as I already said, in New Jersey and New Jersey history of Germans in New Jersey. Has been a high school teacher for a number of years, and is currently a lecturer on the subject of Germans in Missouri, but more specifically 48ers, and is going to talk about mapping the United States, drawing the Civil War, right, and so on.
Maybe while these gentlemen work on this wonderful IT thing, Peter, Harro Harring was 4 years in America, New York. Should he have a monument in New York City, yes or no?
Never.
Should he have one of these days?
Maybe he has a monument in
Bridgestone and New York. Thank you.
Can I ask another question?
Come.
You used a heavy definition of freedom, and you gave one with a rather ironic tone.
No, now Peter is waiting for us.
Whether it was Haber's definition of freedom or some ironic kind of.
Is it working?
Freedom is what is left over when everything else is lost. That's interpretation. Is that you or is that?
That's Harring,
That's
He wrote many poems about freedom.
Go ahead.
Still snowing out there? Good morning. I thought we personalized this just a little bit more, and particularly for my own life. And what I'm doing is talking about actually a cousin who was a 48er. And I thought you might like to see it, I did anyway, through the eyes and personalize it of someone who came to this country for all the reasons we've been talking about. And what happened is my dad was an immigrant. In 1928, he left he didn't like what was going on. He said that our last name, Lubrecht, was always, anybody with the last name was related to us. And sure enough, in 1937, he picked up a phone book, He looked up the name Lubrecht, traveled to Brooklyn, and found out the woman there was his cousin. It's her father we're about to talk about today. And I've been piecing this together for my whole life, and just a lot of it just landed last week, the information on this 48er. Carl Schurz said at a German-American Day in 1895, "My country, right or wrong, in one sense, I say so too. My country, and my country is the great American Republic. My country, right or wrong, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right." This was pretty much the motto of my family. We got to Brooklyn, we met cousin Auntie Florence, and the first word anybody ever says in New York growing up is, "My family, he came mid-shorts." I never knew quite what that meant. So this is the story of Carl, changed his name to Charles Theobald Lubrecht, who's a Brooklyn 48er. And you see the picture behind me that his son posted in a memoir of Brooklyn as Pa found it. Pa's philosophy was that the things a man does not do is often as important as the thing he does. He thought the troubles of the world were caused by people who tried to do too much. It was a bad habit which should be curbed, for it generally led to interferences with other people's business and happiness. This is a quote from Pa. We'll find out later why he was called Pa. This I thought I would share with you is Lubrecht's map of Iowa, which was so detailed that if you look at the little black spot at the top, that's where we are right now. Waverly's included, Waterloo, all the small towns. How he ever did it, I don't know. But we'll continue. Our family's origin is Strasbourg, West Prussia. And it was von Lubrecht, and they were two Bunkermeisters, which I guess is textile manufacturers or drapers. They were dragoons in the Napoleonic Wars, but politically it got bad, so they took off, and the family went in about 3 directions. One went to St. Petersburg, Russia, Pennsylvania, and Blaubeuren. Now Blaubeuren is just south of Stuttgart. As you can see, the family settled in this little town, opened a bookstore and a press. This is Blaubeuren today in Süddeutschland, Baden-Württemberg. The name means Blue Brook, and I've been there, and the brook is indeed blue. This is the church in Blaubeuren, the Stadtkirche today, and across the street from the Stadtkirche was the Lubrecht Buchhandlung and Stadtzeitung, which came out every 2 weeks. Unfortunately, they included political commentary. And August Adolf Lubrecht was married, he's a publisher and bookseller, he was married to Matilda Hasses. Now she was a relative of Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, who was a German idealist philosopher, inspired by Kant and a colleague of Hegel, who was also related to Christoph Gottfried Badili, who was born indeed in Blaubeuren, and he was a philosopher again. So the stage is being set for not being politically correct in any shape, sense, or form. Adolf's partner was Julius Hasses, and they were publishing this weekly newspaper. Well, as things happened in June of 1849, the Prussian troops invaded this little town, and as family lore goes, and I have no substantiation, I know that the police closed down the newspaper and the bookstore. Freedom of speech was gone, and I understand the family was warned that night that the police were coming to get you and arrest you, so they packed up whatever they could carry. They came south across Lake Constance or the Bodensee to Zurich, Switzerland. Now that was a problem because there wasn't a lot of money, they didn't have an occupation, and with other German expatriates. So Julius Hasses, I think he had a cousin in Brooklyn. He leaves Switzerland in 1849, heading for Brooklyn, New York. He came out of France, Le Havre, and came to Brooklyn, where he opened, this is Brooklyn, by the way, taking the ferry from Manhattan, where you'd land, into Old Brooklyn. You have note there is no bridge at this point, and the ferry was the only way to go from Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn. He finds his way to Brooklyn via Rhode Island. And in 1851, he opens an office in Lower Manhattan where he commuted daily from ferry to Brooklyn. All these years, the whole family lived in Brooklyn. Bridge or no, they took that ferry every morning. Somewhere in his travels, And this is, by the way, the first map he published, and the only map we have. All of the works I have by these men, the artwork and the lithography, is what's left. What's on the screen today is all that I've been able to find of their work, some in the Library of Congress and some other places. But Julius Haas's published this pictorial scene of Brooklyn in 1851. Somewhere along, and also, 20-year-old Charles Lubrecht joined Haas's in 1865 via Montreal, Canada, where he had become a map colorer. And he changed his name from Carl Theobald to Charles T. Nobody's too sure why. We think the Know Nothing Party was not too happy with anybody with a German name, so they all took and anglicized only the first name. This is New York as Pa found it. His son, who was an artist as well, placed this in the family memoirs. Meanwhile, Julius Haas's had traveled most of the East Coast, I think, and he met an Austrian named Benoit Jäger, who was an entomologist, I always get that wrong, a bug guy, and who had been appointed, he's from Austria, he's an Austrian, and Benoit Jäger was appointed by the Tsar of Russia to catalog all the bugs in Eastern Europe, including, he left the Crimea, traveled all over Europe, published all these bug books, and then comes to North America, where he published this book, The North American Insects. He became a professor at Princeton in 1831, and he stayed there until about 1848. His papers are still there. He was a zoologist, language teacher, and a bug guy. Don't forget the bugs. Somewhere in this process, Julius Haas's meets him, and meets his daughter, who is Fanny L. Jäger. Now that bothered me. That's an odd name for an Austrian guy to give a girl. Turns out that Jäger had been to Haiti, where he met Fanny L. Wright, an early feminist who imported slaves to Haiti to free them, was married to a black man, but was an avowed lesbian. Can't make this stuff up. So Fanny Jäger, she becomes Fanny L. Haas. She marries Julius. Well, Julius moves back to Brooklyn, in Bedford Village, which was a teeming little village at that point. Might have been pretty interesting, as we'll see. And the father must have gone, as old people do, you know, we all get that way, and they took him in. So now the house had Benoit Jäger, Haas's, 3 kids, and who shows up but Charles T. Lubrecht looking for a place to live, so they give him the basement rooms. And with that, he opens his own map store, and this is from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. So Haas's had a map and print coloring. Now, family lore says he was 2 doors down from Currier and Ives, and they did a lot of their work too. Essentially, the map was printed and it was hand-colored with a stencil. Charles Lubrecht opens his. So you can see they eventually go into business together as the map and print coloring and all map mounting. And they published popular charts. These were used, I believe, to send over to Germany to the immigrants, that they could have a map to find their way through the United States when they came over here. In fact, the copy of his map I got was from a cousin of mine outside of Stuttgart, where it had landed all the way from Brooklyn 100 years later. Julius Haas's dies in 1864. He was in the Civil War or of disease in Brooklyn, I do not know which. I can't track him in the Civil War because, like so many German soldiers, he took another name, more than likely. He left 3 children and an aged father-in-law in Charles's care, so Charles adopts this family and lives with them. Well, in 1865, April 15th, Lincoln is assassinated, as we all know. Charles Lubrecht finds this lady, Phoebe Ann Hannaford. She's an early women's rights activist again. She's the first woman minister in New England. She was a writer, and again, she was of the alternative lifestyle as well. He takes her book and translates it into German and issues it 1 week later. This is the only German life of Abraham Lincoln that I know of, published by Haas's and Lubrecht. There are still some copies out there. I do not know who did the woodcut of Lincoln. It may have been him, I am not sure. He then started to issue these post-war woodcuts. Now, I don't know if they were in color, how he got them anyway, but they were issued so that you could put them up on your wall, in your parlor. And this is all the Union fallen, all the generals and so forth. And not to belabor the point, there's another portrait of Lincoln. He followed with the Southern. He was not going to leave any stones unturned. He got permission to do a portrait of Stonewall Jackson in the middle there, and all the fallen brave soldiers of the Confederacy. Side point, the designer of the Confederate flag was a man named Nikolai Marshall, who was a German, and was also a German officer in the Confederate Army. So I guess he covered all the bases at that point. He also did a portrait of Grant. I think he had met him, but I'm not 100% sure, because Grant died in New York City. And he also, this is the new president, the guardians of our country. You get the feeling, though, that he's, and I did find out this is true, I got the feeling that he's a rock-ribbed Republican. He really didn't even like to talk to Democrats, I found out later on. Very much in support of the Union. In 1866, Charles married Mary Elizabeth Phillips, the girl next door. Now, next door to him were the Phillips, who was a builder. And he comes to Brooklyn to build houses. And one of the carpenters who was working for him was Walt Whitman Sr. And so that Charles T. Lubrecht, on his journey to Brooklyn every day, usually rode the trolley car with Walt Whitman. And you'll notice that the young Walt Whitman and the young Charles Lubrecht have the same beards. They seem to copy the beard style through the whole lifestyle. The story is young Charles was next door to Mary Phillips, and Mary's father really wanted Charles to marry someone else. But he said, you know, there's a nice looking German fellow next door. Now Mary's the daughter of the American Revolution, rock-ribbed American. So she climbs up on a box and looks over the fence, and at that very moment, Charles looks at her and she falls off the box, scratches her face, wouldn't talk to him for months. Eventually, they did get married and had 3 children, William, Charles Albert, and Florence. And they went and moved and bought a really big house in Merrick, Long Island, which was their summer cottage, because people went out to the Methodist meeting there. German Americans at that point did that. The reason they chose the Methodist is because Charles and his young bride, before they were married, used to go spooning. I don't know if anybody who's young here knows what spooning was. It's just got a lot quicker later. You know, now I think the word is hook up. I don't know quite what's going on. But they would go meet at the camp meetings, the religious revivals, and sit in the back row. That's the way he was. Here's some of the people that he bumped into in early Brooklyn. Mark Twain was at the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, and they went there for a speech with Henry Ward Beecher, the abolitionist. Now Beecher absolutely refused, as the story goes in this substantiation, to speak until he was paid. So the man said, well, that's okay, I'll write a check. And Beecher says, I want cash. So they had a pass the hat, Twain, Charles T. Lubrecht, put the money in, then Beecher got up and spoke, and preferably with a gold piece, thank you very much. And then the other person he ran into again was Twain was commuting to this church from New York. Twain lived on 10th Street in Manhattan for a while. And I always wondered, what it would be like to hear these guys talk. What do they say? Good morning? I don't know. And then he was taken, Charles was taken to meet President Cleveland. And he shook his hand, he said, but that's about all he was going to do. Whitman wrote, I loved well those cities. I loved well the stately and rapid river. The men and women I saw were all near me. Others the same, others who looked back on me because I looked forward to them. The time will come, though I stop here today and tonight, and it's from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which is the name of the poem he wrote as he crossed back and forth before the Brooklyn Bridge. This is what Niels was talking about before, the grand procession in honor of the Fenian exiles in New York City. Those are the same two he was talking about, and this is what the reception was like. I could never figure out what the Fenian exiles were, you know, and thank you for telling me that, because I looked it up all over the internet, and they give you bits and pieces. This is City Hall in New York, and it's published by Charles T. Lubrecht, the artwork being the same print. Again, you can hang it on your wall. He also was commissioned by the Holy Roman Catholic faith, which he was not, to do this lithograph for the wall. It's a process that I'm not totally familiar with in the sense that it's done on limestone with grease and paint, and all of the posters and church documents, like you see baptismal certificates, were done with this process. So it was a lucrative business in the time, this is about 1871. This was Lubrecht's map of the Union Railroads of the United States. We're not too sure how he did it, but he was commissioned to give a railroad map for the very first time in the 1870s, again, so you could travel comfortably. He also did this must have been an Irish connection. This is King William III, or King Billy as they call him in Ireland, crossing the line. They didn't like King Billy much, and I just heard a recent quote saying, we still don't like him. This was the romantic Victorian prince, and this is all I have left of his artwork, is this is someone ascending into heaven, going heavenward. This is a notebook he left behind, which I've been trying to track his descendants down, have found them. He wrote poetry. Most of the family did, I don't know why, and this is a commentary, and I'll share it with you. It's in a little red notebook in German, or Alte Schrift, as well as English. Charity is one of the most noble virtues, like the violet that lays hidden under the grass and the moss, and from these sends forth the fragrant smell so true. Charity silently does the good work, the satisfaction of God in our own heart, being the great recompense of charitable deeds. They said that when he was on the street or saw somebody in trouble or heard of an issue, he would always give money and never ask for it to be back. He was always helping someone in need. This was part of his creed, which also became, in our own family, part of what we were about as well. He finally assembled in 1901 our gang. This is the cabin in Merrick, Long Island. And lined up in front is the whole menage. Wife, 3 children, 2 sisters, and a young lady in a family wedding. They took the young lady in, said she was the maid, so she could give birth in private. Remember, in those days, women didn't do that. And so he took them in, and she's listed in the census as a domestic. And also, you will find in the front 2 women. Charles went back to Switzerland, brought his 2 sisters over to visit, and they ended up staying for the rest of their lives and living with them. So Emma and Amalie are part of this crew that's in Merrick, Long Island. Published the pocket map of Pennsylvania for travelers. Again, I always think of the Germans trying to find their relatives up that way on a visit. He did this poster, the champions of people's rights. He talks about economy, honesty, reform, and our people very strong in a Republican sense, but also willing to take anybody's money to go into business, use it for business. This is a steamship Victoria, another one of the anchor line that you would want to put up on the wall. Fortunately, he did not work for the White Star Line. Whoops, go back one, put a different picture. These are these romanticized prints. We had something like this hanging in our living room for years, and his daughter had them as well. For some reason, in the front parlor, you had these very romantic kind of, I guess romantic in the sense of idealistic. This is another one about roses. The young lady is clutching a rose. Whether he drew these and who the models were, I have no idea. This is Our Nation's Choice. This was a campaign poster for Garfield, and Garfield was assassinated, as we know, so Lubrecht did Our Martyr Presidents, General James Garfield and Abraham Lincoln, with the drawings surrounding that. Again, I don't know if they were school posters or what was the use, but they were sold from downtown Manhattan. By the way, his office, one was on Vesey Street. The building is still there, but if you stand on the corner, you're looking right at Ground Zero. So it's right down. All the publishers were down here. Matthew Brady was down in the lower part of New York. And many of the 48ers, too, opened businesses in that area if they were in the printing trade. This is another one, an idealistic golden hours with the children. Children are awfully quiet. He loved the Brooklyn Bridge. He loved the Brooklyn Bridge. The wonderful East River Suspension Bridge. He used to take the children for walks across the bridge. But he always took the ferry, which you can see in the lower corner, across the river. Side note, Roebling was a German who came in 1831 to New Jersey. There is now a Roebling, New Jersey, where he opened a cable factory and used the cable to build this famous bridge, which he never saw completed. His son saw it to its end. It still looks somewhat like that today. Then Charles Lubrecht published Charles Lubrecht's Pictorial Atlas of the World for only $5. And I have a letter saying if you buy them in quantity, you get them for $4. But he would never take the person's money until the maps were delivered. Now this atlas, if you can find one, is no longer $5. They're somewhere up north of $400 to $500 in the rare bookstores, Library of Congress. Those big fold-out maps are 6 feet square, and if you have a spare $25,000, you can buy one from one of the map auction houses. So I don't know why, because they hand-colored, I think, and so detailed. This is Centennial Map of Pennsylvania, which was done in 1879. And then, I guess he went into some other business. I found this. He went into the Circassian water business. And I have no idea how that relates to anything or even what it is. But I suppose you put it on your handkerchief, ladies, when you're feeling faint. I don't know if they still do that, you know, and then you can breathe this in, and it's refreshing, relieves fatigue, nervousness, and headache. I always wonder if there was something else in it, but we're not going to go there, like, you know, laudanum. But I always picture the women, you know, holding the handkerchief to their nose gracefully. This is Charles Lubrecht at about that same time. Note the beard is getting longer. He built this house on 966 Bedford Avenue, New York. And you'll notice it's a Google picture because it is still standing there as we speak. It's not in a very good neighborhood, just sold for $800,000. Got a spiral staircase still up the middle. I was never in this house as a kid. I was in his daughter's house a little bit further down in Brooklyn, and it's like stepping back into another era. Now, everyone called him Pa. Why? Discovered that in the neighborhood, when he came home from work, the children were waiting for him to get chocolates, because he gave the kids candy. So every kid in the neighborhood called him Pa. Where's Pa? And they still they call their grandpa Pa, and she was Ma, or to her friends Lizzie, which I think is kind of an assimilation. Here's a man coming from this little town of Blauer in Germany and landing in this Victorian neighborhood in Brooklyn, which was torn apart, quite frankly. It's in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He saw them building the Monitor, I believe that's the one, and he also heard the screams of the draft riots in Lower Brooklyn, which nobody talks about, and also the fact that not everybody was for the Union. This is Pa toward the end of his life, with the beard. And what is scary about his resemblance, my dad is his third cousin. My dad looks just like him, and his sister. The resemblance was incredible when they were alive. He died in 1926 in Brooklyn. And this is his legacy. His daughter Florence, who's pictured in the upper right-hand corner, the lady I knew as Auntie Florence, was one of the early alternative lifestyle ladies in Brooklyn. I knew Auntie Marion, and they were together for 50 years. I only discovered it after she died. Was the influence early on from Fanny Wright and Hannaford part of this, that it was acceptable? Nobody ever said a word about it, and nobody seemed to be too bothered by any way anyone else lived. It was, you know, personally not my business, they thought. This is a picture of Dr. Charles A. Lubrecht. He's a gentleman lying on the floor with the large ears. And look to his right, you see the two girls holding hands or with their hands on each other. That's Auntie Florence and her partner. And this is at a wedding, surprise wedding. Charles is over on the far right. Lizzie, his wife, is on your right, sitting next to him on the floor. This was a surprise party for a wedding couple. Dr. Charles A. Lubrecht became a surgeon, mechanical engineer, and a medical illustrator. His books are in the Library of Congress. And I think it's important when we talk at a conference like this about the 48ers that we look too at the legacy that they've left behind or are pushing forward through the upcoming generations. And our whole family has been involved in the book business, in publishing and so forth. Accidentally? I don't know, you know, welcome to the Twilight Zone. This is my dad, Harry Lubrecht. He died in 1997. He never wore a beard because it would turn white and make him look old. He's about 85 in that picture. And he changed his name from Heinz Dietrich to Harry because he felt that would Americanize him. Also, he took some guff from some other immigrant groups. He published an early American botanical catalog, which is the definitive work in early American botany, and also was very much involved in the book trade. One of the first publishers who was importing books from Germany to market here in the United States. Dirk would know the Frankfurt Büchermesse. He went for 60 straight years and had his almost anti-penultimate stroke over there. And then that brings it down to yours truly, and I just published 2 books too, which I'd be welcome to talk to you about. One on Germans in New Jersey just came out with History Press, and I discovered there was no real book on the Germans in New Jersey, and that's our 300th year in New Jersey. First church service, 1713, October this month, in what was New Germantown. It is now Oldwick. So hopefully we can pass this legacy on, and I would leave you with a quote from Carl Schurz. To be a German now means more than it meant before he belonged to one united nation. He who calls himself a German now must never forget his honorable obligation to his name. He must honor Germany in himself. The German American can accomplish great things for the development of the great composite nation of the New World, if in his works and deeds he combines and welds the best that is in the German character with the best that is in the American. Carl Schurz, German Day, June 15, 1895. Thank you.
Well, we did a good job and did it on time, and we could afford still 2 or 3 questions, so everybody. Please.
A comment. Library of Congress. These kind of books, let me recommend to anyone interested, and you may know her, Margaret Truson. You don't know her. She's in charge of German and Dutch literature.
She's retired now.
She's retired, a good friend. She helped me for many years with all graduate students going there. Margaret Truson, German and Dutch literature.
K-R-E-W-S-O-N.
And it's an incredible institution. If you take graduate students there, they have separate rooms for you to take them for studies, and they have the great maps, like the first American map. We got a copy in California from that, a gift, and it's in the Jefferson wing, you know, of the Library of Congress.
Well, my dad's collection of botany books is in the Smithsonian, because he's another story. He's one of the immigrant booksellers after World War II. He's not Jewish, but the rest were. And so before he died, he gave that collection to the Smithsonian. His papers are at Carnegie Mellon and also at the Grosvenor Club in New York City.
Wow. I will pursue. I'll talk to you.
Okay, got it.
The mall in Washington has fantastic institutions, and the Smithsonian is a guy I'm very familiar with who represents the Smithsonian on the West Coast. Yeah.
One more. Well, with that fantastic presentation, don't we have one more? I guess we'll just clap.